as I am on this lecture, because I think it will be really interesting. So I won't talk anymore. I will just hand it over to Teacher of the Year, Rickard Friberg.
Okay. Thank you. So thanks a lot. Thanks for coming, and thank you, Anton, for organizing this. And so yeah, as I'm Rickard Friberg, I'm with the economics department here. So if you did your bachelor here, you've seen me before. If you're doing your master's, you might or might not have seen me, but good to see you here anyway. So what I want to talk about today is a topic that called managing risk and uncertainty, and it's a topic that I've been working on for much of my career, but especially these last 2 years. I've been working on a book that's coming out now with MIT Press this fall. And what I try to do is, integrate insights for lots of different fields and put them into a common framework. So, trying to understand how should we think about, how can we deal with risk and uncertainty, like today. The lecture was supposed to be in Torsten. Realized that there's a concert there. We needed some flexibility, and we needed to adjust to that in some way. And I'm glad to see that we managed that well. So what I'll be doing today is to take some highlights from this book. Okay, so just to set the stage, let's move back some 2,000 years. Caesar, and the statement "Alia jacta est." So there's actually the sources at the time are sort of divided about what he said. Some say that he said it in Greek, some say that he used a different tense and so forth, but "Alia jacta est" is sort of the version that has caught on. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but essentially, Caesar was a Roman general at the time, walking with his troops towards Rome. Okay, so there's the river Rubicon, which was sort of demarcating what used to be the Rome proper, sort of, and the rest was the provinces. Okay, so for a Roman general to enter Rome proper at the head of his troops was the same thing as rebellion. So that was sentenciable by death both for Caesar and for his troops. Okay, so he stood there at the river, according to the sources at the time. He stood for quite some time thinking, should he cross the river? Should he do this? Okay, so if things go badly, there's death and humiliation, and things are not looking good. On the other hand, if things go well, he gets to power and I guess enjoys that. Okay, so what's the point of bringing up Caesar here? Well, I think it cuts to the core of a lot of issues that we're thinking about when dealing with how can we deal with risk and uncertainty in our decision making. In particular, what can we much of the theories that we have are sort of built on objective probability distributions, throwing dice or spinning roulette wheels or pulling balls from urns. To what extent can we use results from such situations where we can use repeated experiments to situations where we can't do repeated experiments? Okay, so what do we know about the likelihood of different outcomes? And here I will be using, and I use in the book, a definition that goes back to work by a Chicago economist, Frank Knight, from 1921. I don't know if you're familiar with this distinction, but distinction between risk on the one hand and uncertainty on the other hand. So risk would be things that we, randomness that's captured by objective probability distributions, like throwing a dice or spinning a roulette wheel, or also probability distributions like the ones over height. Okay, so we know that height of humans, typically follows a normal distribution. In the discussions, and the normal distribution, of course, is very convenient to work with for a lot of reasons, but it's clearly not the only one that we have in our toolbox. There's uniform distributions, and in the book I stress that even variables that we think are very far from normal could be captured by a stable probability distribution. So think of city sizes, for instance. If we were to sample the size of cities from Sweden, so just picking random places, we would pick Vimmerby and Gällivare and so forth. We put lots of sort of small places, then all of a sudden you would pick Stockholm or Göteborg or Malmö. So if we're thinking, if the same kind of situation pertained to height, we would be picking a lot of people around 160, 170, 180, then all of a sudden someone 200 meters tall or 1 kilometer tall would sort of pop up. Okay. So do we have a distribution for stuff like city sizes? Yeah, actually. So if we look across a lot of countries, city sizes are very well described by type of power law distribution. So there's talk of Zipf's law, saying that the distribution of city sizes is pretty much the same in all countries, and follows the Zipf's law and this particular power law distribution. Actually, the same kind of power law distribution that firm sizes follow. Okay, so this is something that I stress, that just because things are not normal doesn't mean that they cannot be described by probability distributions. On the other hand, there's tons of stuff that we can't describe with objective probability distributions. So, and that then would be what Knight calls uncertainty. So in particular, these would be cases where you have strategic interaction. You might be making your own best guess of what would happen, like Caesar did or Columbus did when he sailed off. But different people will have different guesses, and there's no sort of scientific way of saying who's right. We can't just do repeated experiments. And of course, this is particularly important when the set of possible states of the world are hard to describe ex ante. So, this is sometimes talked about in quoting Donald Rumsfeld, talking about unknown unknowns. Okay. You could think of an airline. Okay, so this is, I guess, highly relevant these days also. There's lots of risks and uncertainties that affect it. Okay, so some of the stuff that affects profits, like price of jet fuels or exchange rates, vary a lot. Okay, but maybe they don't follow precisely a kind of probability distribution that we are, have defined ex ante, but they at least we can look at historical records. We think we have some understanding of the sort of supply and demand mechanisms that drive them. Whereas other things like strikes or the kind of accidents that happened to Malaysian Airlines last year, where the MH370 just literally flew off the radar, just disappeared. And then another plane got shut down over Ukraine, or the Eyjafjallajökull, the Icelandic ash cloud in 2010 that shut down airline traffic across much of Europe. That was, I hope it was not a total surprise for airline executives. It was total surprise to me that sort of ash clouds could shut down air traffic. Or 9/11 when Al-Qaeda flew into the Twin Towers, and that really affected air travel, of course. So there's a whole range of randomness that affects profitability, how firms are doing, and some are more akin to risk in the 19th sense, and some are more akin to uncertainty in the 19th sense. Okay, and the question is then, should risk and uncertainty affect your decisions? And if so, in what way? So if we're thinking about an airline, should you be using financial hedges? Should you be buying the planes rather than leasing them? What kind of contracts should you have with suppliers or with personnel? Should your fuel risk affect the kind of planes you're buying? Should you invest in flexibility in various ways? So these are the kind of questions that I'm motivated by in the book. Of course, one problem when we're thinking about uncertainty is that if we don't have a probability distribution, so how can we think about expected values? How can we maximize something like expected profits if we don't know the probabilities of different events? Okay, so this is an old problem, of course, and people have, in a sense, the typical response has been, well, let's try to see if we can, how would people act under their subjective probabilities, their best guesses, sort of treating that as subjective probabilities, more or less. What we instead is focusing on the book is that, well, we might not know the probability distributions for various kind of events that are akin to uncertainty, but we can sort of think of worst case scenarios, okay, and use those in our decision making. So if we think of Columbus, possible worst case scenario would be that the expedition perishes, they all drown. Or for an airline, the worst case scenario could come about for lots of different reasons, but say would be that planes are grounded for a couple of weeks. Okay, no revenue. These need not literally be the worst case. I mean, would be sort of the worst case that you're willing to contemplate. Columbus, the worst case could be that there's something like the movie Alien that lives somewhere out there in the ocean, and Columbus comes there, they sort of realize that humans exist, and they come back and eat everyone. Or for planes could be giant meteor crashes into Earth, and we have like a winter for 5 years. Okay, so it's not necessarily want to take account of that when you're designing firm strategy. So we're thinking worst case is sort of the worst that you're willing to use in your decision making. Okay. So with these concepts, risk and uncertainty, you could think of placing different industries in different categories. Okay, so you could have situations where it's low uncertainty, low risk, like local bus service, regulated monopoly. Could have situations where there's little uncertainty, but high risk. So typically if you have, say, mineral producer or something like that, where there's an input or an output price that varies a lot. Okay, so that would give you high risk, but there's not much technological development, there's not much strategic interaction, there's not much of the kind of things that give you uncertainty. On the other hand, you could think of situations where there's high uncertainty, relatively low risk. So perhaps you're developing a new product. There's a lot of technological uncertainty. Say you're working on, maybe not, but say fuel technology for tomorrow, fuel cells or batteries, these kind of things. Maybe your costs are mainly wages, which are stable. Not much risk in that sense. But lots of uncertainty about what kind of technology will work. Okay, what will be successful, what will be possible to do. Or think of Nokia, say 2005, 2006. Has a sweet position as sort of the global leader in cell phones. Might have some inkling that some other technology is going to arrive. Someone is going to have a really nice concept that might compete with me, but not really having an idea of what that might be or from where it will come. Okay, so it came from Apple. And then you could have situations where you have both, both high uncertainty and high risk. And I would argue, say that airlines are a case in point there. And of course, this is meant to sort of organize thoughts. You could have no sort of law of nature that airlines should be here. And also over time, of course, things could change. So if you're looking at the cell phone market today, for instance, you could argue that, I don't know if there's a lot of risk, but clearly there's a lot of uncertainty. There's strategic interaction with a few competitors, and issues like, do you win in spectrum auctions and these kind of things. So lots of uncertainty today. But if you go back to, say, 1970s, so before you were born, but when I was a kid, you had national telephone agencies, Sweden Televerket. That was pretty low risk, low uncertainty environment. They had a monopoly, people picked up the phone, and that was pretty much it. Okay, so we want to see, can this kind of mapping be useful for thinking about how a firm should respond or think about its strategy in the face of risk and uncertainty. Okay, so in the book, I sort of organize a survey of the literature, if you wish, around four different, you could say, core strategies or concepts. And to do that, I put a very simple, super simple structure on. So it's not meant to be like a roadmap. It's meant to be something that, a mental map kind of for thinking about things. So to evaluate those strategies, think of the kind of setting where you have 2 periods. Period 0, today, where you decide strategy, how are you going to do, what are you going to do. So in the airline case, what planes are you going to have, what kind of contracts you're going to have, etc. And then in period 1, you take actions depending on the constraints that you face based on what you decided in period 0, but also based on realizations of risk and uncertainty in that period. So you could think of it as sort of as a menu type of approach, and today in period 0, make reservations at a restaurant. That in period 1, when you actually go to the restaurant, determines what options that you have in that period. Okay, if you go to a particular restaurant, you have a particular menu of choices. If you go to another restaurant, you have another particular menu of choices. And we think of strategy as choosing a menu in that sense. Okay. So we think there's one source of risk, something that we call S, as an expected value. And there's another shock then that's possible that we call uncertainty, and we assume that there's a worst case scenario for that we're willing to assume. So ALI, the lowest. Okay, so profits in period 1 will be given by profits which depend on the strategy I, a function of this S, which could be a spot price or an exchange rate, something like that, and then the uncertainty shock. Okay, so as we talked about before, if we're thinking, okay, so say you want to maximize expected profits, well, you run into the problem that how do I form expected profits over something which I don't have a probability distribution for? Okay, so how do we get around that? Well, I propose that we use the following, that you have an exposed constraint that you want to hold. You want realized profits exposed to be at least as high as a lower threshold. So call that K. Okay, and this could be, it could be minus infinity, then this doesn't bind, and you don't have problems. But otherwise, you would choose a strategy I that maximizes expected profits among the different strategies that give you sufficiently high profits in the worst case scenario. Okay, so this lower threshold could, for instance, be motivated by capital market imperfections along work in Fruchtstein and Scharfstein, 1993, where you need sufficiently much collateral to be able to access capital markets and to continue making investments. So essentially, if the value of the firm's profits fall too low, you go bankrupt. Okay, so we will be using this to evaluate the strategies. Okay, so the first strategy you could think of is what we call a benchmark one. Okay, so essentially do nothing. So we have, if you think of an exporter, just to exemplify, so S here would be an exchange rate. There's profits in the home currency, which you're interested in. So a more depreciated exchange rate are associated with higher profits. Okay, or an appreciation, lower profits. So this is where US is going now, for instance. Okay, so we assume that S is random here, but as you might remember from courses that you've taken, I mean, if we have a linear function like this, the expected value is unaffected by a mean preserving spread or a mean shrink of the variable S here. So variability in S does not affect the expected value. So here, in a sense, there's no point in managing risk. Okay. What about uncertainty? Well, we assume that uncertainty shocks can shift profits. So in a case like this, if the exchange rate would be moving down in this direction and that combines with the worst possible realization, worst case scenario for the uncertainty, we would be in negative territory and we wouldn't want to be there. So we would want to consider some other strategy. Okay. But if profits are linear and uncertainty is low enough, then the benchmark strategy is one that we would typically go with. Okay, say that you're concerned about these lower realizations. Well, you could use financial hedging. Okay, so there's a large literature, of course, looking at that. The epitome of financial hedging is that makes profits insensitive to the variable that you're hedging against. So S in this case. So that would give you completely flat profits. We assume that there's some small cost of doing that. So if the exchange rate, say here, were equal to 1, profits would be slightly lower if you're using financial hedging than opposite. and you would have the same potential for uncertainty shocks. So, there's lots of courses, of course, in how to use financial hedging to deal with risks, and a lot of firms are doing that. So that's one area where we actually know quite a bit about what firms are doing. What do we know? Well, we can see that a lot of firms are using financial hedges to manage risks, but they do it mainly for shorter exposures, mainly for what we would here say risk rather than uncertainty, and it's also more prevalent among large firms. In addition, particularly an influential paper by Guai and Kotari show that the amounts of hedges, the amounts of financial derivatives contracts that firms have are typically too small, so this is building on US data, too small to have a major impact on the overall value of the firm. Okay, so you could argue from this would be consistent with the story where financial hedging is mainly about making cash management, in a sense, easier, rather than sort of protecting the firm from really bad negative shocks, the kind of shocks that would severely affect the investment behavior of firms. Okay, so to exemplify that, I went to the annual report of a firm, Black Diamond. They make outdoor gear, climbing gear, and skiing and stuff. So in their annual report, the US annual reports, if you're large enough, you're supposed to fill in an annual report called 10K, a specific format. And item 1A in that 10K statement is risk factors. So this is risk and uncertainty in the terminology that we have in the book. But anyway, if you look at the Black Diamond risk factors, 4 out of 30 that they mention are what we would say risk in a Knightian sense. So it's seasonality, weather conditions, interest rate risk, exchange rate risk, and commodity price risk, essentially. And out of these, they actually hedge exchange rate risk for up to the medium term. The rest they just leave. But the other 26 are more like Knightian uncertainty. Okay. For instance, and of course I should say, it's not like we can't say that all of these are created equal in some sense. Maybe the 4 are much more important than the 26. I don't think so, but that is a possibility. So what one is, for instance, here, number 26, I don't know what number it was, but a substantial portion of our sales and gross profits come from a small number of customers. Losing any of those, and they're in trouble. Okay. How could you hedge that? Well, if you go to the financial markets, you're likely to have some problems, mainly based on asymmetric information. Who's most likely to want to buy insurance against these kind of things? Well, the ones that have the largest chance of losing customers. So you have adverse selection. If you were to have such insurance in place, would you be more or less careful about keeping your customers? Well, probably less careful. So you have moral hazard. Okay, so you have asymmetric information problems that hinder the development of financial instruments to hedge against uncertainty. Okay. And it's hard. We can't really, when there's uncertainty, it's hard to use sort of past historical data, these kind of observations, to price things right. Okay, and I'm not aware of much sort of literature looking at, how much firms engage in financial hedging or in operational hedging, so adjusting operations, etc. I've done with a PhD student here of mine, Niklas Amberg, done some work on Sweden. But there's also stuff for the US in Bodnar, Graham, Harvey, and Marston have a working paper, Managing Risk Management, where they say what are the means by which material risks are managed, financial contracts, and operational structures. Okay, so these are very large global firms. Even so, we can see that only in one of these cases is financial contracts given a higher importance. Okay, so foreign exchange risk. For the others, operational structures are deemed as more important for managing risk than financial instruments, and that's particularly true for the case where you might argue that uncertainty is sort of the best, most relevant. So geopolitical risk. What if Iran and Saudi Arabia were to go to war? What's the probability of that? What kind of financial instruments would you buy to handle that? I don't know. I don't think firms know either, which is why they're saying that, well, they don't use financial instruments to a large extent to manage geopolitical risks. They rely on other things. Okay, so other things brings us into the third strategy that I want to talk about. What we could call operational hedging. So essentially striving to make, taking real decisions in terms of, how do we produce goods, how do we sell goods, what kind of airplanes do we have, what kind of contracts do we have with our staff, to limit the sensitivity of profits to variable S here. We also assume that operational hedging is associated with a lower sensitivity to uncertainty shocks. Okay, so some examples of that. So one could be, so Triner and others, 2014, have a paper where they're looking at US airlines in particular, and comparing financial hedging to operational hedging. And in their case, operational hedging means buying more fuel-efficient airplanes. Okay, so if you buy, more fuel-efficient airplanes, say this is the inverse of spot prices for jet fuel. So as jet fuel becomes, more expensive, you have less of a hit if you have bought more efficient airplanes than you would if you had sort of a gas guzzler. But it might also be that, in normal times, sort of when prices are on average, profits are actually lower with those more fuel-efficient airplanes because they're more expensive to buy. So that's one form of operational hedging. Another form would be diversification. Holding many different products, being present in many different markets, smoothing out shocks to one particular market. So conglomerates, grouping very different things under the same roof would be an extreme version of this. So, if you go to Korea or Japan, they still have a prominent role. Used to have a large role still exists several in Europe and US, of course, still today, but used to have an even larger role. So, one of the funnier examples is, I guess, that Volvo used to own ABBA, for instance. I don't know if you know this, not ABBA the group, but ABBA the seafood company. And of course, the idea was that, buying of caviar, or not Swedish caviar, that is, and seal, etc. I mean, that's pretty stable over the business cycle, whereas, car sales are really varying over the business cycle. So, grouping these two things together will give you a more smoother ride. And you could, you might connect, decreasing diversification to better functioning capital markets, for instance. I mean, so this level K that you need to stay above, if you have easier access to credit, maybe you don't need to own ABBA. You could also see holding cash as a form of operational hedging. So a number of papers with this as a key paper, Bates, Cullen, and Stultz, show that firms are holding more and more cash, and the more risk they're exposed to, the more cash are they holding. Okay, so it's sort of, precautionary cash holding in a sense, keeping your powder dry. Okay, and the last strategy that I want to mention, or that I use for categorizing the previous literature, is then what I call the flexible strategy. So we could zoom back here to this one. So this would be, you're an exporter in the benchmark, and say, you have a certain price on your export market, which gives you a certain quantity, which gives you a certain cost. Okay, if you do nothing, if you keep your price in the foreign market fixed, and for simplicity assume everything else is unchanged, how are your profits going to be affected by the exchange rate? Well, just linearly. There's a given, so your costs are not changing. There's a given foreign currency revenue that's going to be, worth more or less in your own currency depending on what the exchange rate is, but it's going to be a linear relation. Okay. What if you're flexible? What if you, okay, so here, the krona is dropping 20%. Maybe I shouldn't just keep my price in the export market fixed. Maybe I should adjust that. Maybe I should, engage in some extra marketing. Maybe I should, do something. So move here. What would happen to profits? Well, if you're doing something, it must be better than doing nothing. So profits would be above here. And you would also think that, the more you're diverging from a point like this, the greater would the difference be in terms of adjusting optimally versus doing nothing. Say here, I'll put more mass, probability mass in the tails. We know that the expected profits will be increasing. Okay. And here again, we assume that a flexible strategy makes you also better to deal with uncertainty, not just with risk. So in the book also look at this. We could, an early example of thinking about this is a paper by Walt Roy from 1961, noting that expected profits of a flexible price taker should be increasing in variability. Stigler, 1939, thinking about this, how can we invest in flexibility? When would it be worth to do so? Essentially, you sacrifice some efficiency gains in normal times for flexibility, for the ability to adjust better to changes. And that could regard flexibility in how you organize costs, could regard flexibility in terms of revenue. Are you able to set different prices to different customer groups? Or could regard flexibility in how you organize the firm. How do you transmit information within the firm? Do you give a lot of authority to people out in the organization? Like think Handelsbanken, where a lot of power is given to the heads of the offices, the local offices, to make a lot of decisions. Giving a lot of authority to the people who are closest to the action, in a sense. So there's a large literature on this sort of coordination versus adaptation. Where in the firm do you have decision power? You could see this as a way of organizing along flexibility as well. Okay, and then one could put all these different strategies in one figure and essentially compare them. And that's what I then also do in the book. And essentially noting that, if things are normal, there's little risk, little uncertainty, the benchmark is likely to be preferred. But then, for example, the more risk that you have, the more attractive is a flexible strategy going to be. Okay. And you can then, map it to the risk and uncertainty matrix that we had originally, thinking about, what strategy would fit best for different kinds of situations, and also, thinking about, okay, what the flexible strategy, what would it, for instance, amount to in a particular case in terms of production, price setting, etc. So that was essentially it. Hope to have shown you a very stylized framework in which to sort of think about a lot of the results that come from very different literatures, from financial literature, from operations research, decision theory, etc., and how to make decisions under risk and uncertainty. And of course, the book goes into a lot more depth. In particular, one of the stuff that I've been finding the most fun to work on is combining data with oligopoly theory and making using that to do simulations of different cases.